Welcome to the Report Card with Nat Malkus. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar in education policy at the American Enterprise Institute. On this podcast, we look at research, policy, and practice efforts to improve the lives of families, schools, and students. A perennial issue in education research has been turning around persistently low-performing public schools. These schools have garnered the inglorious name. A lot of people call them failing schools, and a lot of other people hate that term. But there's some truth in it. These schools are consistently low-performing, and they end up failing academic generation after academic generation of students. That's why it's so important to turn them around. But turning around schools is hard work. Whether you do it from the inside, where you may face resource constraints or just not know how to do it, or whether you want to turn around schools from the outside, trying to get principals, staff, and actors to turn things around. This is tough work. Well, the Obama administration in 2009 took a $7 billion swing at the problem. They did this through a program called School Improvement Grants. And these grants gave money up to $6 million over several years to try and help turn around these low-performing, or if you like, failing schools. What was the result? Well, the government's own evaluation study by IES found there were no statistical improvements, not in reading, not in math, not in graduation scores. Yikes. For $7 billion, we certainly hope there's more to it. And of course, the story is more complicated than that. So to help us unpack both SIG and the work of turning around school improvements, we're going to have two conversations today. One is with Deven Carlson, an associate professor of political science at the University of Oklahoma, who's done research on school improvement grants and their effectiveness in particular places. After that, we'll talk to Michael Sonbert, the founder of Skyrocket Educator Training, about his efforts to help turn around schools on the ground. Well, without further ado, let's welcome Deven Carlson. Deven, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Nat. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, Deven, before we get into the results from SIG, help listeners understand, what did this program look like? These school improvement grants, or what people usually call SIG, what was the idea behind them and the aspiration?
So SIGs are the latest in a long line of initiatives to turn around low-performing schools. You can go back to the 90s and the comprehensive school reform effort and kind of trace the evolution of SIG from there, where there's a sense that rather than focusing on individual aspects of school instruction, you want to focus on the school as a whole. And SIG is intended to do just that, to use some evidence-based practices to really try to turn around the entire culture in an entire school.
Sure, and when this came in, this wasn't just solely the government coming forward to take a huge federal move on improving these schools. I mean, part of the reason that SIG money, $7 billion, came into play was because of the recession, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The annual appropriations for SIG are typically pretty small, in the range of $500 million. It was under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, better known as the stimulus, that the U.S. Department of Education infused an additional $3.5 billion into that program. And so what we typically think of as SIG, when people are talking that in policy conversations, is that $3.5 billion infusion, not the annual appropriations of about $500 million or so.
Right, and this program existed under the Bush administration, but when during the economic downturn, we needed to get some money out into the economy, this was one of those shovel-ready projects everybody was looking for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the U.S. Department of Education, they revamped SIG rules in 2009 at a time that corresponded with that infusion of cash into schools across the country.
So what could schools do with the money? What were the strings tied to it in broad strokes?
Sure. So to be eligible for SIG, a school had to be in the lowest 5% of schools on some sort of performance measure that each state put together. And for eligible schools that were selected for a SIG award, they had to implement one of four, what USAID referred to as evidence-based turnaround models. They could close the school, they could restart it as a charter school, or they could implement the transformation or turnaround models.
And what's the transformation and turnaround? That was what most schools did, right?
The vast majority of schools went with either the transformation or the turnaround model. Both of those models required replacing school leadership. The turnaround model required further replacement of more than 50% of school staff, while the transformation model required implementation of a teacher evaluation system that included student growth as a meaningful component.
And so how much money did, your typical school get?
The awards ranged a little bit from a low of, around $800,000, $900,000 to up to $6 million. And typically these grants were administered over a 3-year period with roughly equal expenditures over each of those 3 years.
Deven, take us through this, I think from anybody's perspective, relatively disappointing national evaluation on SIG. Basically, what did they find, and how did they compare SIG schools to what other schools?
The national evaluation sampled, a few hundred schools across the country in a number of districts across a diverse set of states, and compared those schools that received SIG grants to schools that were just ineligible to receive those grants. And the result of the evaluation found very little effect on any of the typical student outcomes we measure: reading scores, math scores, high school graduation. They did find some evidence that SIG models used more SIG-promoted practices than other schools, but that was not causally related to the SIG award.
Deven, lots of people use this to say, we just wasted several $1 billion on some foolish program that didn't work and so forth. But you're an academic, which is supposed to sort of translate and also find the flaws in these major studies. Was this study flawed, or was it actually, we didn't do any good?
So, there's no such thing as a perfect study, and this study was undoubtedly informative, and for SIG advocates, it had to be disappointing. That said, I think there are a couple of critiques of the study of ways that it might not tell the entire story. First is that SIG was administered at the state level, right? There was more state autonomy than much of the discussion around SIG really recognizes. The federal government gave grants to states who then gave competitive awards to districts. And so states had influence in determining who in their state would receive a SIG grant. The national evaluation doesn't really recognize that. It selects a set of districts that aren't really reflective of the political realities of the way the program was administered. So that's one reason we might not really think that the national evaluation tells the whole story. A second reason is that the statistical approach it used was appropriate for what it was trying to achieve, but it could only detect relatively large effects. In statistical terms, we might say the study was a bit underpowered. And so, together, these two critiques: one, we should put more stock in state-by-state analyses, and two, we might want to have larger sample sizes in order to detect smaller effects, might lead us to look at a different and a more diverse set of analyses of SIG across the country.
Yeah, that makes sense, Deven, but I've looked at the national study, and, a lot of people are looking at what we always look at, right? Math and reading scores in high school graduation. And while I certainly take your point that it's underpowered, I also see that the point estimates for math was basically zero. No matter how powered your study is, we wouldn't care about a 0.01 effect size. And it was actually negative in high school graduation. So I'm a little bit leery of the power argument, the selection argument, and where we should look for these things. I find that really interesting. And of course, we've seen other work in the states, including some that you've done, that have found that in certain places, we've seen statistically significant and large enough results that we should care about. Can you take us through some of that?
Yeah, so there's been SIG studies done at the state level in several states. I've done work with Stefan Lavertu in Ohio, where we evaluated the first 2 cohorts of SIG recipients in that state. We found pretty significant, pretty large effects on math and reading scores. We were not able to look at high school graduation in our analysis, but we saw that SIG eligibility and SIG receipt really increased math and reading scores by a meaningful amount for these schools, for students in these schools.
And we've seen this reflected in the work of others in some other states as well?
Sure. Yeah, we've seen positive results from California. We've seen positive results from Massachusetts. On the other hand, some other studies in different states have shown things to be more flat. That reflects the national evaluation. And so I think the major story from my perspective is that, it's a little bit more complicated than the national evaluation. Some places had positive, some places had no effects. And what we should really do is concentrate on the diversity in results across states. Look at those states that had positive results, see what we might be able to learn. Look at those states that had negative results or null results, and see what might have been done differently that could have contributed to those patterns that we see across states.
So in Ohio, which is where you're most familiar, Deven, let's talk a little bit about sort of like the cost benefit. And I know that no one's really done a cost benefit of this because that's pretty difficult, but how much more money than these schools we're used to having in Ohio came from SIG. And then what kind of results did we get from that? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, was the juice worth the squeeze?
So in Ohio, the average school saw about a $200 to $300 per pupil increase per year for each of the 3 years the grant was in place. So put that over the baseline per pupil spending, and we're talking in the range of 15% increase in per pupil spending. That's significant. And the size of the achievement effects were 0.2 to 0.25 standard deviations. There's always a debate over what's big, what's not big.
Sure.
Those in the context of educational interventions, 0.2 to 0.25 is a fairly meaningful increase.
I'm sort of torn here. The aspiration for SIG was we need to fix failing schools, these persistently low-performing schools. And they gave it a good go, whether it was perfectly conceived or not. They certainly brought resources to bear. But this cuts both ways, right? Because these Ohio schools got a 15% bump in per pupil funding for 3 years. My question is this a good long-term investment? Do we know, and can we guess?
So we don't know yet, but I think that's really the crucial question. Did this just change these schools for a 3 or 4 year period, or is it really going to fundamentally alter the trajectory they're on? And I think that's where it's really important for future work to follow up on these schools to see what happens when the money goes away. There are reasons to think that these gains we see might not hold. The accountability era shows that if you put a lot of effort at turning around a school, you can get really large short-term effects, but it's difficult to sustain those over the long term. On the other hand, maybe the money really facilitated a culture change and it put these schools on a different trajectory. You can spin stories both ways, but I think what's really going to be necessary is to look at the data as they continue to roll in and see how these SIG schools really perform over the medium and longer term.
Sure. I've looked at some of the research. AIR did some deep looks in some of these schools where they surveyed, what happened after SIG as far as your practices, and did the teachers actually think they improved? And of course, like a lot of what we've been saying, it was all over the map. They had some schools where everyone said, yes, our practice improved, and they had others that said, no, some of it actually got worse. So it's going to be some work for researchers in the future to try and gauge the long-term effects of this. Deven, one thing that could be the nightmare scenario that I'm concerned with is that in some places, I'm sure it's not across the board, but in some schools, SIG could be a net negative, right? So hear me out on this. You have a school that's low performing, and so we give it a big bump in funding, right? 15%. And it doesn't actually improve much. And it looks like a lot of SIG schools didn't actually turn around with a lot of improvements, but they all got the resources. Now, what happens 3 years down the line if these schools sort of operating with these extra resources just sort of got used to that without putting up better numbers? What happens at the end of 3 years when we take away that funding, when they no longer have the SIG grants to buoy them? I mean, is it possible that in some of these places we could actually see a net negative effect?
So I think that's a really valid concern, Nat. These schools had 3 years to get used to operating with a 15% bump in per pupil expenditures. And they've probably optimized their practices to that. They've maybe made hiring decisions, made curricular decisions around having that money available. And then bam, a 15 to 20% cut in per pupil funding. They're going to have to make some difficult decisions around personnel, difficult decisions about what happens in the classroom, and whether that could potentially play out in student performance. If we look at, recent evidence on the role of school funding, on the role of money, we have pretty good evidence that money does matter on the margins. And so taking away 15 to 20% of per pupil expenditures, that could be problematic.
Yeah, it's sort of scary. I'm certain it's what no one would have intended, but the road to hell is paved with those kind of intentions. Deven, in our last couple of minutes, what kind of lessons do you think we should draw from SIG? I don't think the problem of persistently low-performing schools is going to go away, but what can we draw from this relatively expensive effort? We should definitely try and wring as much wisdom out of it as we can.
Yeah, I think there's a few lessons we can learn. One is that turnaround policies can work, but they're not destined to. And I think the problem is at this point, we don't have a good enough understanding of when turnarounds are going to be successful and when they're not. In some ways, the turnaround literature and the evidence on turnaround seems like the charter school literature in its early years, where we knew that some charter schools were fantastic, other charter schools weren't that great. it took us time to really get an understanding of what that policy landscape looks like. And I think that's one place that we're kind of at that place with the turnaround literature. We have evidence that they can work, but we have evidence that they won't necessarily work, and we need to figure out when they are and are not likely to work. The second lesson I think we can learn, and this is a lesson we have to keep learning over and over in education, is that federalism matters, that the way states do things can be important in how things turn out for students in their schools. And so paying attention to what happens at the state level, how they interact with their districts, that is as important as putting together a broad, large-scale national evaluation, because politics and the way that our governance structure works, it really matters for turnarounds and it matters for other policies as well. So I think those are kind of the two big lessons that I've taken away from, the last 10 or so years of SIG's existence.
So let me ask one last question. I mean, a lot of times we have folks who boil down the problems of these low-performing schools to some pretty simple arguments. And one of them that gets a lot of play is, well, they just don't have the resources. They just don't have the resources. SIG certainly seemed to provide the resources. I mean, this was a big bump, a bigger bump than most any other schools can realistically expect to get in any other sort of venue. And it certainly didn't turn around the fates of these schools like we'd hoped. Now, is that a fair characterization, or was there enough sort of constraints on how they used these funds that it still could be a resource issue?
So I don't think we have a great answer to that question. I think it is a truism that these schools saw bigger funding bumps than just about any other intervention that we've seen in recent times. And so to the extent that resources might have been constraining what could happen, SIG should have at least alleviated those constraints for at least a short period of time. And so I think this is where really the longer-term studies can provide some insight. Looking at the transition from when those grants were available to the schools to their disappearance, that can provide us with some understanding of the role that funding played in whatever gains that schools exhibited. And so, we don't know the answer, but I think it's something that we can get some good evidence on in the future.
Deven Carlson, thanks for coming on to talk to us about this momentous, if perhaps somewhat underwhelming, intervention in low-performing schools.
Thanks, Nat. I enjoyed it.
Deven Carlson's discussion about the School Improvement Grant Program gave us a good 30,000-foot view over school turnaround efforts. But it raises the question, what do these look like on the ground? To get an angle on that, I next have a talk with Michael Sonbert, CEO and founder of Skyrocket Education Training, who works with current school leaders to improve their practice and turn around schools on the ground. Michael Sonbert, welcome to the Report Card.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm excited.
To lay the groundwork for this conversation, just tell us, how did you get into this work with Skyrocket?
Great. Yeah, I worked for Mastery Charter Schools in Philadelphia, teacher, instructional coach, and most recently as director of strategic partnerships. And we were charged with running technical assistance for different networks around the country. Just made sense. I'd made so many contacts doing that work, and I was so excited about that work. It just made sense for me to go out and do it on my own.
And so basically, on a thumbnail, what does Skyrocket do?
So we support, our core belief is that we can improve schools through teacher and leader training. So we are focused entirely on increasing leader skill so that they're not only better at their jobs, but so that they can support the teachers in their buildings at being better at their jobs.
So this is interesting because we spoke previous to getting on with you, with Deven Carlson, about the School Improvement Grants Program. Yep, and the main idea behind that program was, well, we got to intervene in these schools. They're very low performing. We have to do something. And the vast majority of those approaches was, we need to change out the staff, a bunch of the staff, the principals, and so forth. You have a different tack.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, well, one of our beliefs is that in any school, there are probably 10% of the folks who aren't on board, potentially 15, who probably shouldn't be there, and that varies where you go. You could have, 1% or no folks. But as a whole, our belief is that we just need to make folks more effective at what they do on a daily basis. And so we are not of the mindset that we need to swap folks out and swap new folks in, because we've seen some pretty radical change in places with some of the same people. But just with more training and more support and constant and consistent feedback.
All right, so to make sure that everybody understands this, because I can hear right now the teachers that listen to us groaning in the future as they hear you say this, and you know what they're hearing? They're saying, this guy's solution is professional development. So just to make sure, what does Skyrocket do? Because it's not your typical, professional development approach.
Our core belief is that it's the leaders who aren't effective enough. So they are not able to consistently and proactively provide feedback for their teachers aimed at an instructional North Star. And so our feedback is not only our PD rather, is not only is it differentiated based on where the particular leaders are, but it is almost entirely leader-facing. Yes, that stuff then becomes teacher-facing once the leaders are trained on it. But even in that situation, nothing that we present to folks exists in a vacuum. It's always directly connected to either our leader coaching rubric or our teacher coaching rubric, and the stuff scaffolds and it builds off of itself. And so we've often, at different points, we've worked with those skeptical teachers who you're talking about who are groaning listening to this, or at least at the start of this conversation. And there's a sense from some of them like, I just need to tolerate this for the next couple of hours and then these folks will be gone. But what we found is that A, the PD is so engaging that that teachers are invested in it. B, they take it back to their classrooms and they're like, oh, actually, that thing makes a big difference. I'll share a story about that in a moment of a pretty radical shift we saw the other day. But then C, all the feedback that we're providing to leaders and all the feedback that they're providing to teachers is directly related to the thing that we just trained on. And so it's not this drive-by PD that, as you said, makes the teachers groan. And quite frankly, I don't blame them.
Well, maybe your last answer is going to keep some of those teachers hanging on for at least a little longer to hear how Skyrocket is different. But I do want to just note, again, sort of going back to the school improvement grant approach, and a lot of what we talk about when we talk about improving teaching is swapping out teachers. And this is very different. Number one, it's sort of ambivalent to who we get rid of. It's more focused on how we make the school an engine for teacher improvement and the leadership there, rather than preparing teachers or dropping them off at the schoolhouse door and then just plugging them in as sort of jigsaw pieces, better jigsaw pieces. Yeah,
I mean, I was at a Catholic school in Milwaukee 2 weeks ago with a school leader. She's been a principal for 20 plus years, very, very much operated. This is an oversimplification, but very much operated in like hey, teachers are in their room, they're doing their thing. I'm doing a lot of the building management type stuff, and things are going how they're going. And she ran an instructional coaching meeting with a teacher where they were scripting and practicing and just repeated reps. Let's do it again. Were they working on the teacher's model and making sure that the teacher was clearly modeling her steps for the students? And at the end of it, I said, look, I hope this doesn't come off the wrong way, but I said, small Catholic schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin don't look like this. And she smiled a mile wide, because the idea was like, you're just like, regardless of where you came from, what your experience was, like, you've completely embraced this approach. And it's working in your building. Teachers are bought in. You're leading in a way in this last year or so, and even these last few months, in a way that you haven't in years past. And so, Nat, to your point, this is not about let's just find the best folks, quote unquote, around best. Let's take the folks we have and train them on a model that's not overly dense, that's not overly verbose, that's not vague, that's hyper focused, that's succinct, that's precise. And let's give the folks the training that they need to be as effective as possible on it.
Right. So you talked about a Catholic school. Usually we think about public schools. What schools do you approach to work with, or do you agree to work in? And will you take any school, or are there some sort of prerequisites buy-in to get Skyrocket to help them out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, at the end of the day, the more folks are willing to embrace our approach and to go all in, the more effective it's going to be. That's not to say that we haven't worked with schools, public, charter, faith-based, who've said like, hey, listen, we can't implement this at nearly the level you want. We're still happy to partner with them as long as we get buy-in from the school leaders and as long as we can come up with an agreement as to what level they are going to implement. Our belief is that, our approach is so succinct and so precise that even at, 10% or 15% of where we think it needs to be as effective as possible, we still believe, and we've seen that it's going to move leader practice, it's going to move teacher practice, it's going to move student outcomes.
So let's get into the model a little bit. In brief, I'm looking at this rubric, right? We got 3 strands and I got 12 foundational teacher actions and so forth. And it's not that complicated. You've laid it out pretty clearly. How do you use these rubrics and how's the Skyrocket operationalized?
Right. So the rubric that you're looking at, the teacher coaching rubric, it's the foundation of all the work that we do. 3 strands, they're hierarchical, which is pretty unique in this world. You see a lot of folks who do the work that we're doing, training a classroom teacher on clear directions and higher order questions at the same time. Our belief is that doesn't lead to change. The analogy we use is you don't teach somebody who is struggling to learn chopsticks and Tchaikovsky at the same time. And so what we're doing in the world of ed reform or teacher training, leader training, is we're training folks on too much stuff. And so we say we are starting day one with what students are doing in any particular classroom. You'll notice that for each of the strands, there's a student outcome. We're looking at students, and strand 1 is our students on task. And if they are, we're not looking at any of the strand 1 teacher actions, aside from potentially a class where the teacher's extremely negative and we need to get more praise infused in the class because it's going to lead to more content mastery down the road. We're really not addressing any of the teacher actions if the student outcome is being met, because that's what's most important. And so we look at first and foremost what students are doing. Once we land on that, let's say that 50% of students in any given class are not mastering the objective. We then backwards map and we look at the teacher actions that are provided. And we say, well, what's the thing in this class that was missing? Maybe the teacher didn't model effectively. And so now we need to look at 2.6. We need to make sure that the modeling is more effective. Maybe the model was fine, but what the teacher was driving at was the wrong thing. Maybe it wasn't the next most important step for students. Maybe it wasn't measurable enough. So we need to start working on looking at writing objectives, which is 2.1. But either way, every person we're working with, they are totally clear on what their teacher action is, what the student outcome they're driving at is, and the steps we're going to take to get there. And on the larger scale, we're training the school leaders to do that work. And so I want to make sure I'm clear on this. We're not doing any direct teacher coaching. We're training the leaders to be able to do that coaching. And you talked about teachers groaning earlier, and I hear you on that, and I agree. And I've also seen teachers with smiles a mile wide when the feedback coming from their boss doesn't sound like, hey, you should try X.
Right.
And it's like this kind of drive-by feedback that, like, well, should I do that or not, and how? And the feedback then becomes, hey, we're working on writing objectives. Let's take a look at your lesson plan. Here are the components of writing an effective objective. It needs to have a measurable verb. It needs to have X. It needs to have Y. Whatever it is, I'm going to model it, and then I'm going to have you practice it a whole bunch.
I'm interested, just for folks who can't see the rubric, there's these 3 strands, classroom culture, right, and then the second one, and this is hierarchical. So after we've got the classroom culture, we work on content mastery, then we move to rigor. But the interesting thing about this that I want to point out and have you comment on is that there's a bunch of concrete specific things to look at. And what you're saying, instead of giving sort of a broad-based set of feedback on a teacher's lesson, is you're trying to help school leaders come in and help teachers work on one thing to improve their practice. Do I have this right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, we believe in the long game. We believe that for too long, folks, teachers, have gotten feedback on too much stuff at once, and it becomes this almost feedback shrapnel that they're hiding from, right? It's just like, I just need to tolerate what my boss says. I need to maybe yes the person a little bit, because guess what? That feedback's going away. It's never going to be followed up on, and I'm not going to actually have to do anything. We're changing that conversation so that we are working on one thing, potentially 2 things. We can work on scanning and praise at the same time. Certainly, we can work on checking for understanding and adjusting instruction at the same time, potentially. But for the most part, we are working on one thing at a time, and we are building this like rock solid foundation.
So let me ask you a little bit about problem definition. You're trying to solve a problem, and that is enabling instructional leaders to actually lead on instruction with teachers. And I'm trying to give you one question here, but it's actually a couple. And the main thing is, where is this content in teacher training? Is it that ed schools that are training teachers and teacher leaders have this content and it gets lost over time? Are they not putting this content in? It seems to me that we'd want a lot of these things already baked into the cake in schools. And what I'm hearing from this model is that there's a bunch of things that we need to work on. So I'm just wondering where the problem that you're solving originates.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just as a sidebar, we're talking to some universities about potentially partnering and doing some sort of micro-credentialing piece because from the research that we've done, in the places where this stuff exists, it's a half day, it's a day, and a lot of the time is spent on theory. And, for teachers, it's a lot of time is spent on lesson planning and your approach to your content. And for leaders, a lot of the time is spent on your approach to leadership versus just the straight up, and I don't know if you have our leader rubric in front of you, but we ran a practice the other day for school leaders about walking down the hallway during a transition and celebrating every teacher and adult who was in the hallway to support students during that transition and addressing every adult or teacher who wasn't. If a teacher was on their phone, if they were at their desk talking to whomever, we practiced getting them out into the hallway because from our experience, the majority of incidences in schools happen during transitions or right after transitions. So we want to make sure teachers are as supported as possible and that students are as supported as possible. We haven't seen any university who's doing anything to that level of granularity. So to your point, there's a lot of theory. I, in fact, had somebody from a university recently tell me, this person is one of the heads of ed at a university. And the person said there's no way to really prepare a teacher for what's going to happen when they get to their school. So we want to give them a lot of theory, and then when they get there, they'll figure it out. And we believe the exact opposite. We believe that there are things around school leaders' calendars, there are things around transition work, there are things around typical conversation, things around culture systems, all these things that can be brought in on day one so that folks aren't trying to figure this stuff out on the fly, which is ultimately hurting, it hurts the adults in the building, but it hurts the kids, right? Which is the reason why we all do this work.
I want to ask about reception and evidence. So first off, principals and instructional leaders, how do they like this 6 months in, a year in?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we find is that folks love the way they are now talking and thinking and acting about their job, about instruction, about what it means to be a leader, particularly in places where there's been an absence or a lack of leader training, that folks are absolutely loving the shift that they've made and that they report out that it's really hard. And the conversations we have are really interesting. I had some folks recently be like, I'm struggling to get my 4 touch points per teacher I'm coaching per week. I'm getting about 2 or 3. And I said, think about the conversation. And I want to do better. I'm really struggling, this, that, the other thing. And we obviously problem solve with them and work through it. But I said, think about the conversation we're having versus the conversation you were having a year ago, which was like, I don't coach teachers, or I give the kind of the flyby feedback on really whatever I see, not necessarily grounded in anything. You've completely shifted your practice. So folks like it a lot, and they say it's really hard, which this work is, and we're okay with that.
Yeah, it's hard work, I'm sure. Let me ask you about evidence. Have you found a way to evaluate the progress that you've been able to make, either in moving teacher practice or student outcomes?
Yeah, so we have. I'll talk about the leader stuff first. We have, for our leader rubric, ultimately we're looking at student outcomes, scores on state tests, scores on MAP assessment, things like that. Then we look at, smaller things, school-wide things, scores on benchmarks. We're also looking at stuff around attendance and tardiness. The thought being that if we create a school that's warm, where teachers are supported and getting consistent feedback, and kids are excited to be in the building, that they'll have less tardiness, and we'll have less absenteeism. We're also looking at teachers are reporting out. So we have teacher satisfaction surveys, and we do that for both teacher and the leader stuff. In fact, we just launched, for our new cohort of school leaders, we just launched our new survey, and some of the feedback's coming back now, and some of the questions around, I see my school leader as a consistent presence in my building and as someone who gives aligned and consistent feedback. And teachers and adults in the building report out as to whether or not they agree, strongly agree, that they don't agree at all on that stuff. And so we're looking at a lot of different metrics at this point.
To turn back around a little bit and close out a little bit on turning around really low-performing schools, is this approach something that, it works in your average school or in high-achieving schools to kind of push them up? Or is Is this doable in, persistently low-performing schools?
Yeah, I mean, that was the vision when we started Skyrocket, was that it would be traditionally low-performing schools. There's a foundational place that we are striving to get folks who've been, school leaders and teachers who've been traditionally under-supported. The goal of this has always been that we were going to work in consistently underperforming, underserved schools, underserved neighborhoods, which doesn't mean that we're not working in some places where folks are higher performing, because we do, but the vision and the majority of the schools with whom we're working lie in that first bucket.
Michael Sonbert, thanks for coming on and talking about what Skyrocket's doing to improve schools. And if people want to check you out, they can go to wewillskyrocket.com. Is that right?
That's perfect, man. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks for listening to The Report Card with Nat Malkus. And special thanks to our guests, Deven Carlson and Michael Sonbert. If you enjoyed the podcast today, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. And if you liked what you heard, don't forget to rate us and review us on iTunes or Google. It helps others hear about the show. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us at ed.podcast@aei.org. Until next time, this is Nat Malkus.